Welcome back to New Persuasive Words. I am, as always and ever, Scott Jones.
I'm Bill Bohr.
And Bill, a historic event this evening. Mike Tyson will step into the ring with Jake Paul. This is a comeback of comebacks. And I understand that whoever wins will be in the cabinet.
Right.
This will be, this could be a cabinet level.
It'd be more qualified than some of the early nominees. Yeah.
I'll tell you, if you're talking right now, who is the most formidable with regard to the possibility of ultimate fighting or anything, it would be JFK or RFK Jr. He's in fantastic shape.
He's in fantastic shape. That is. The guy who's Department of Defense, was he a Green Beret?
No, National Guardsman. He was in the Guard.
No, he was an Afghan.
He was in Afghanistan and
Iraq.
Iraq, but he was an ROTC guy.
Oh, ROTC guy.
Yeah, no, not almost. It's almost the same thing, but it's different.
He has a Crusader cross on his chest. I did, and he's on marriage number 3. I got that all in my little background check.
Well, he's a nice looking guy, and sometimes it takes a little while to figure out, what's going on there. So,
yeah,
we have a cabinet. So we have an incredibly attractive cabinet. I think in every age bracket. I mean, I think RFK is a good looking guy for his age, and we've got Christy Noem, who shot her dog, and we've got someone I have real affinity for, Tulsi Gabbard. One of the loveliest women in Congress.
You and Putin, both.
Me and Putin. Hey, look, Putin. You can't be wrong at everything about everything,
right? Yeah.
So this is. I can't. I mean, we were joking about Gary Busey at one point, but that doesn't seem far off.
That could be an upgrade. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's just very. Bill. This is
doing God's work. Yeah.
But will you watch the fight this evening or no?
Let's see. We got something going on tonight. What time is it on?
I think it's at 6 p.m. Eastern.
That's kind of early. I guess he's old.
Well, yeah, exactly. You got to get. Well, he probably eats. Is he a senior citizen? He probably eats at 4.
6 o'clock. It's 6 o'clock Eastern.
Wait, I'm looking right now. I can't be right.
Can't be right. That's hilarious.
That can't be right. Yeah, 8 p.m. Sorry, 5 p.m. Pacific. 8 p.m. Sorry.
Yeah, it's on Netflix, right?
Yeah, there were 3 professional boxing fights before Tyson and Paul entered the ring. The fight is scheduled for 8 2-minute rounds.
Okay.
Is this boxing or is this?
No, it's boxing. Yeah.
Ultimate fighting. It's not ultimate fighting, right?
No, it's boxing. Yeah.
And Jake Paul is not an ultimate fighter. He's just a normal boxer.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. Although he talked like an ultimate fighter the other day when Tyson slapped him. Then became like the wrestling pre stuff. So. Anyway, yeah, I don't know. We'll see. Yeah, it's an interesting thing. I would not like to fight Mike Tyson at any age.
He looks fantastic.
Yeah.
Jake Paul was best known as a popular YouTuber and former Disney star before he decided to become a professional boxer. He could be in the cabinet right now.
Yeah, career choices, folks. Career choices.
I mean, he fought his second professional fight in the undercard of Tyson's fight against Jones, but has since promoted himself to main event status. Loquacious and promotable. Paul currently has 27 million followers on Instagram.
Wow.
18.2 million followers on TikTok and 4.6 million on X. This guy could be in the cabinet. I said that as a joke, but this guy looks better and better.
We'll see how the fight goes. We'll see.
We'll see. I'll tell you, this is something. All right. So Bill, we're talking to lots of people. It's been about a week and a half since the election, and a lot of people are anxious. A lot of people are thrilled. A lot of people don't know what to make of things. This is an interesting cultural moment, to say the least. Is that fair?
That's one way to say it. It's an interesting cultural moment. Sure.
Am I understating the case?
I think you might be understating the case, but life is a cabaret, right? That's it's kind of that movie was a musical. Is that an interesting? You could call that an interesting cultural moment as well in Berlin. So, yeah.
All right. Well, Bill's making references to Berlin in the 30s.
I'm just talking. I'm just talking show. I'm just talking Broadway shows.
Broadway shows. There you go.
I'm just jazz hands over here.
So I thought, all right, we'd talk about election.
Yeah.
Today, because everybody's talking about it.
Yeah.
Everybody's thinking about the election. I titled this the Real Election Podcast because I want to talk a little bit about today. We decided we would talk a little bit about the doctrine of election, which has been something that has a history in the church, not one that's not without controversy.
A lot of controversy, and also one that's kind of sometimes I think it's used in broader strokes than the Bible does, right? In terms of, sometimes when Christians talk about the doctrine of election, it becomes very close to kind of a determinism or a fatalism, or it becomes this broad stroke where everything is part of God's greater plan in a way that may not quite be what the Bible was talking about. So yeah, why not? I think why not talk about the election?
I mean, Bill, you mentioned the Bible. I mean, Donald Trump was asked famously if he was more of an Old Testament or a New Testament guy. He said 50-50. Where are you at?
Well, if I was going to be true to my Reformed heritage, as you remind me that I'm Reformed periodically when I do very much. Yeah. I would say I'm 100%, 100%. How about that?
Like 50-50, 100. So this is election is certainly something that is biblical in that it has a huge thrust in the in the Old Testament and the Hebrew Bible, in the sense of God in the midst of the primeval history, or at the subsequent to the primeval history in Genesis 1-11, begins the reclamation of the earth, begins by trying to beat back the curse with the blessing, in the call and election of Abraham. And in Abraham will be chosen a family that will become kind of a clan, that will become a nation, that will be the instrument of God's healing and saving presence in the world.
Right. And we're talking about the people of Israel.
People of Israel, right.
Yeah.
Now, I was talking about this Trump administration.
Well, some have merged those, right? Some have merged those. Matter of fact, I think there's what's interesting to me, this is not the topic, but how all those premillennial Christians all of a sudden have got on the post-millennial bandwagon of a kind of reconstructionism of the Christian, making the idea of Christian, America being a Christian nation, which has its roots in a particularly, I think, unfortunate expansion of the doctrine of election that, the early founders of this country, the Calvinist Puritans and such, has this idea that America now is the new chosen place, that the Christians that settled America in Massachusetts were going to be, we're in that same kind of line of the people of Israel, which follows in a certain kind of reading of Calvin, right?
Yeah. By the way, I was just listening to a podcast from the Constitution Center today and Jeffrey Rosen, the host, was talking about Puritans and just how John Adams, how John and Abigail were so Puritan, and how Abigail Adams was always chiding John Quincy to restrain his passions. And, John Quincy's he's the Supreme Court judge. I forget what was he Chief Justice or something?
No, John Quincy, the House of Representatives after,
or in the House where he was. Well, I forget what
he was Secretary of State. He was Secretary of State. Right. Under Monroe, yeah.
So he's John Quincy Adams is saying, "Oh my gosh, if I could just restrain my passions, I could have conquered war and slavery." And Rosen said, "I thought having a Jewish mother was rough, but having a Puritan mother
Well, but they were like pure. They were like the worst of both worlds. They were Puritan and Unitarian, so it was kind of, or they certainly leaned towards the Unitarian reading.
By the way, John Adams and Abigail thought that when they were recording, they were reading. They had discovered. I think Adams had figured this out in Pythagoras or something, that like this accounting of your faults, sort of like the sort of rigorous moral inventory. So that's what they did in their courtship. They listed each other's faults, and so
usually
she
you
said-
usually have to be married for a while.
Yeah,
before that
exactly.
happens.
That usually happens at divorce court, but you know, they said so. She said to Adams very kindly, you know, sort of, because he could, yeah, it could be kind of arrogant and rotund, and she said, you know, it's just you're so smart that you intimidate everybody, and you just got to watch that. And he said to her that she needs to play the piano more, practice her piano more, read more, and that she's pigeon-toed. And she said she'll work on the piano, but it's inappropriate for a gentleman to comment on a lady's posture. So for our listeners,
there we go.
You know, don't comment on ladies, you know, posture, and you'll be well in keeping with Puritan sensibilities.
Yeah.
So so in the Hebrew Bible, the doctrine of election is clearly corporate, right? It's not not a sense. It's not the sense of a sort of decretal will of God that sorts people into a bifurcated anthropological structure, right? The sheep, goat, goat, sheep. I mean, if you're a real Calvinist, oftentimes it's goat, sheep, goat. Yeah, it's just, especially if you're the Orthodox Presbyterian.
Yeah,
I had a friend who was Orthodox Presbyterian, and his fantasy was to get run out of the denomination, because then he would know he would be faithful like Machen. So, you know, there you go.
So yes, he there's a man who needs some work on his fantasy life. But
of course, yeah.
Well, it's interesting too, and so the context of Christianity, Second Temple Judaism, there was a real debate exactly who was in and who was out, and you know, both the backdrop of both Jesus and then Paul's Judaism was a sense where, and I would say Saul of Tarsus was at one place, and Paul the Apostle took on a different position within Judaism. But you can see there's kind of a spectrum of who was in and who was out. Saul of Tarsus probably would have said that only a remnant of the people, of the Jewish people, are truly the elect, right? And then you'd have someone like Hillel, or maybe then Paul the Apostle, had a much broader view of all faithful people, including faithful Gentiles, would have a portion in the life to come. So, you know, what you see in the history of Christianity is actually anticipated in that first century debate that Christianity arises out of.
I think Trump of Mar-a-Lago has a remnant. He's winnowing down. It's payback time, man. Yeah. So I absolutely agree with you there, and that you do have in the New Testament, right? I mean, the corporate mindset is still there, but there are texts that lend themselves in places like the book of Ephesians. You know, those he called, he predestined. You know, those wait, that's the book of Romans.
Romans, that's Romans.
I'm sorry, that's in the book of Romans. I'm thinking of in Ephesians, in Ephesians 1, where it talks about in the opening chapters of Ephesians, where it's talking about the sort of predestination of the people of God, for good works. And, you know, there seem to be at least more of an individual possibility of reading those texts. Although the most famous one, I think, Romans 9, is probably not meant to be individual.
Not at all.
Even though it does start off talking about Jacob and Esau, and God, you know, God loving Jacob and hating Esau before they had done anything, so that God's purpose in election might stand. And of course, that in Western Christianity has been read that has had a programmatic, since St. Augustine has had a programmatic kind of interpretive role, right? In understanding the doctrine.
And not without problems, right? You know, I actually still think the most important chapter on election is Ephesians 1. It gets carried over into Ephesians 2. I think that's the clearest discussion, at least, of how the doctrine of election, when it comes to salvation and this idea. And of course, the insight that Athanasius and then Bart picked up on was that really it's about, I guess that passage, from Ephesians, I don't have it open, but from Ephesians 1:4 through 18 or whatever, there are about 17 instances of dative prepositions: in, by, through. And so the idea that we are chosen in Christ, we are redeemed in Christ, through Christ. So this idea of Christ really being the election one, and that our corporate election, or if you want to say our individual or corporate election, is all about being in Christ. And so there's both. I think in Ephesians 1, the baptismal, what happens to us in baptism is very present in Ephesians, but that's always about being baptized into a people. So I think, if there is an individual nature to the talk of election in Ephesians, it's really about how the one, and we individually participate in Christ as the people of God corporately do. So I think, I think it's a very powerful passage. I think it's one of the most powerful passages in the New Testament. And it's in some levels where, the classic idea of it starts with one, goes to a people, ends up, from Abraham to the people of God to Jesus, the new elect, and then to the whole world. I think that's actually a very good reading of Ephesians, what's going on there, including if you go into chapter 2 as well.
Yeah, no, with Augustine, you do get a sense that, first off, Augustine's got a very strong doctrine of grace, right? So, if in the context of the debate with Pelagius on just how free the will is and just how much divine grace we need, he's willing to go to infant damnation, and I respect that. If you're willing to go to infant, when I think of Augustine, I think of Jack Nicholson. You want me on that wall.
Well,
you need me on that wall.
Well, he certainly doesn't start there, but those last two works of Augustine, by that point, he's debating Julian. So it gets dark on the predestination of the saints and on the perseverance. Those last two doctrines are on. No, it's not. It's on predestination and then on providence. Those last two works. It's a shame the Visigoths didn't come maybe a year early, because I don't know that we're that edified with those late Augustine works on this issue. Yeah, I think he's more nuanced in the early debate. And so
you're saying this is like the end of Vegas Elvis? Right. It's really just not good.
Well, we've talked about this before. I can't remember who it was. It was a famous Lutheran scholar that said that maybe it would have been better if Luther had not survived after 30.
Yeah. So it's probably true for many of us.
Well, I don't know. Not for me. I'm much
it's more, good enough for Jesus. It's good enough for me.
Good enough, much more grace filled at this point. Anyway, yeah.
So Augustine has a programmatic role, and the city of God is a story in some sense. When he gets into the positive, after he tells you in the first 1,000 pages, working mostly of Varro, as I recall it, this ancient work of religions of antiquity, why no other system works except Christianity. And then he gets into the story of these sort of two citizenships, these two commonwealths that are bonded together by common loves, right? The city of God and the city of the world, or the city of man. And that, you start, it's just, you see it in Cain and Abel, and there's sheep and there's goats, and there's just a sort of eternal bifurcation. And this bifurcation is just not in temporal history, right? But goes back into the actual providential working of God. And so this becomes a pretty popular understanding in Western Christianity, but not just it's associated with Calvinism, but Aquinas has a kind of double predestination. This is something that exists in the Western Church subsequent to Augustine, and Calvin kind of doubles down on it, and then the later Calvinists kind of double down on Calvin.
Right. Yeah, right. Yeah, if you're doing math at home, by the time we get to Synod of Dort, we are in election to the fourth power or so, right?
Yeah, exactly. This is strong stuff. This is like this is
Although
strong medicine.
it reads very differently. I mean, again, the word what Aquinas is doing reads very different than, say, the late medieval, the impact of nominalism and this idea of covenant. And one of the interesting things about sometimes paradoxically, an elevated view of the human doesn't always lead to better ideas.
I think it often leads to terrible ideas.
Yeah, right. And like nominalism, the idea, okay, human now, God is so, God is independent. So the whole medieval Thomistic synthesis is broken down, but God is so free that, some of the more extreme of them, people would say, if God's called evil good, God could do that. And so there's a sense where one of the unintended consequences of the Renaissance was a higher degree of spiritual and existential insecurity, which partially, is how Luther gets born, right? Dealing with these very dark, deterministic notions of God. And, it's interesting. I don't know what torments Luther about God at some level leads to the doxology in Calvin. And that probably is not fair, but, Calvin, the extreme glory of God. God is God. God gets to be God, and everything else. The fact that everything else flows from that. So if God being God, what God does must be good, and so the mystery of all that is, not ours to question, but to give God the glory for.
Yeah. So the term, right, would be the inscrutability of the divine will, right? That largely, right. that I mean, you're lucky if you're saved, if you're one of the God squad, then you've got God's benevolent sort of countenance. But
they wouldn't use lucky. You're blessed. You are
blessed,
right.
Yeah. But there's a hidden God, right? There's the left hand of God.
It gets to, if you certainly, you want to ask that question, don't you? About do we get to the God behind the God? That's kind of the, kind of maybe one of the problems of hyper Calvinism, right?
Right. And this is, I mean, you see it in Calvin, you see it in Luther, that the elect are lucky because they deal with the benevolent Father. But there's something else sort of behind. This sort of idea that there's something behind the Father of Jesus Christ, or the inscrutable, divine, mysterious will. This gives someone like Karl Barth the willies, right? I mean, this is terrifying because it takes away the assurance, the comfort, and Barth. See, Barth in Church Dogmatics 2:2 says election is the sum of the gospel. Now, in a lot of Calvinist circles, election is something that they don't really tell it to you until after you signed on the dotted line. Like,
well, and I will say
6 months into becoming a Calvinist, you read the extended warranty,
right.
Well, realize all the things you believe.
I will also say that, I remember when I would do this, do the Calvin lecture at, particularly at Palmer, and, everybody came in, ready to argue about it. And I'm not advocating, I'm teaching what Calvin taught. But one of the questions you do ask, and again, this is part of the, I guess, the piety behind it, is that if you had to make a choice between your destiny being in your hands or in the hands of God, what would you choose? Now, you may say that's a false dichotomy, but let's just say for argument's sense, if you could say, I'm going to give my destiny is in the hands of God, or it's in my own hands. My hope would be most people people of faith or pseudo faith would make the choice of letting God putting their life in the hands of God. And I think that's part of the piety, if you would. That's part of why this was for Calvin, it was a great, you read Calvin talking about it, it's a doctrine of great comfort for him. The parts of Calvin people don't often read. And I think that's part of that dimension of that you can trust. And I think for Luther, it was, if you have faith, if you are struggling, then that's for him, that was assurance enough that you're in, as you were part of the elect. But later Calvinists, that was not the case, right? That became a great sense of anxiety.
Yeah, and you'd get people in these Scottish Calvinist churches that they wouldn't commune, right? Because they
Right.
thought they were so.
Well,
They would just call themselves adherents, and they would just hope that they wouldn't take communion, the quarterly communion celebration, and they just sort of they're just hoping that they would be preserved in a state of grace. So it could lead to some dark things, and this is the backdrop against which Karl Barth develops his doctrine, which my teacher Bruce McCormick said this will be what Barth will be remembered for hundreds of years later, hundreds of years subsequently, and they were writing the history of Christian doctrine. It's Barth's doctrine of election, which Barth really says that the doctrine of election isn't really primarily about God's choice of individuals or God's choice of human beings, but God's choice to be for us.
Right.
That God's choice to eternally be God in a way that it always includes human beings, always includes humankind, and always includes the destiny to be the incarnate one, the crucified one. So I have a couple passages I'll share. One of my favorite passages when Barth just trying to explain what the doctrine of election means and why it communicates so much about God. That it's not just some sort of secret mystery behind some closed heavenly celestial accounting firm where the tallies are being tabulated or something. But he says that he's saying what this means, what election means for God. What a risk God ran when he willed to take up the cause of created man, even in his original righteousness, when he constituted himself his God and ordained himself to solidarity with him. If even the man whose existence we cannot in the least imagine had everything to gain by such a covenant, God himself had everything to lose by it. So he's here saying a man before the fall, human beings before the fall are a risky endeavor. But the man with whom the eternal will of God has to do is not this man, or rather it is this man, not good as God created him, but fallen away from God. In fact, then, the risk taken by God was far greater. His partner in this covenant is not man on the brink of danger, but man already overtaken by it. Man for whom the impossible has become possible and the unreal real. And the fulfillment of evil an actual occurrence. It is the man who gave a hearing to Satan, who did not guard the frontier, who did not keep the divine commandment, who lived otherwise than by the will of God, who thus willed to surrender the whole meaning of his existence, who brought dishonor upon God instead of honor, who became a traitor to God, an enemy and an adversary, who could be visited only by the wrath of God. It was the man whose wife was Eve and first son Cain, who answered a long series of special visitations by an equally long series of fresh aggressions, who finally drove the Messiah of God to the cross, whose name is at the very best Peter and at worst Judas. And God has chosen this man and fellowship with this man in the election of Jesus Christ. It is the lost Son of Man who is partner of the electing God in this covenant. We are not so far speaking of what this means for man. What is quite certain is that for God, it means severe self-commitment. God does not merely give himself up to the risk and menace, but he exposes himself to the actual onslaught and grasp of evil. So, I mean, there, Bart I think, is saying that God in Jesus Christ, and he really leans on John 1. And as you said, he thinks that he's surprised that in the history of the church, John 1, in the beginning was the Word, has not taken a place of greater prominence when the church thinks of election. And he thinks that this is the story, that eternally God saw us at our worst and said that this is the one, who it'll be my project. This is the one who'll be my partner. And that Jesus is not just the elected human, but he's the electing God. He's in Jesus Christ, God chooses to be for us. God chooses to be God in no other way than as the Son of Mary and as the crucified one. And so for Barth, that is not something abstract. That is not something that's bad news. That is not something that has to do with two kinds of people, right? Sheep, goat, sheep. But it's that there's one kind of humanity, the kind that God chooses to be for
Right.
in and as the God of the covenant, the God of grace, the God revealed in and as Jesus Christ. So for Bart, this is ultimately incredible news.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think in many ways, also Bart kind of captures the spirit, I think, of earlier Christology and earlier understanding of this, both Irenaeus and Athanasius. I think I've said before how I, started having a deeper interest in church history was reading Bart at, in print at seminary, and just getting lost in the footnotes and thinking, okay, if I'm going to understand Bart, I need to understand all these Athanasius quotes, which are, the footnotes are forever, right? And dogmatics. And so that's, I do. I think it is a fresh read of an idea that had been lost to most of the Western church.
I'll give one more quote here. Predestination means that from all eternity, God has determined upon man's acquittal at his own cost. It means that God has ordained that in the place of the one acquitted, he himself should be perishing and abandoned and rejected, the lamb slain from the foundation of the world. There is then no background, no decretum absolutum, no mystery of the divine good pleasure in which predestination might just as well be man's rejection. On the contrary, when we look into the innermost recesses of the divine good pleasure, predestination is the non-rejection of man. It is so because it is the rejection of the Son of God. It is so because it is indeed a foreordination of the necessary revelation of divine wrath, but a revelation whose reality was God's own suffering in Jesus Christ.
Right.
So, here I think Bart is saying that, look, that there's not a yes and a no here. There's not a sort of story of like the old Calvinists, when they explain the doctrine, say, well, some people get justice and some people get mercy, so it's all fair.
Right.
I mean, there's not this bifurcated word spoken for Bart. It's one word, that God, that God in Jesus Christ, we have grace and truth, is the first chapter of John tells us. I think that is where I think Bart thinks this is the sum of the gospel, because it doesn't tell us, it tells us more about who God chooses to be and how God is for us than it does about sort of some kind of speculative determination of human destiny.
Right. Yeah, and I think that doesn't, because God is for us doesn't mean we're for ourselves or we're for God. I think the idea that we're still the damned. I mean, I think there's a very real sense that we still reject Christ. There's still that dimension of us choosing, to be the ones who would be happy to have him crucified.
Yeah, and Bart would say that there can be rejecting ones, but not rejected ones.
Absolutely. But it's interesting. I think one of the problems of contemporary evangelicalism is they don't one of the problems. But they don't believe that hell's a possibility for them. In other words, they've committed the same kind of if I would call theological arrogance that liberals did in the earlier generation. I mean, one of the reasons the barons of industry, the guys who made so much money off during the Gilded Age, built all those liberal cathedrals, because no one was going to send them to hell. It's kind of the difference between the medieval church-going, murderer or rich person or corrupt official, and the American Christian one, whether they be liberal or conservative. There's no danger. There's no danger of any kind of retribution for how they act, how they vote, how they use their money, how they exploit the people around them, how they treat the poor and oppressed. What was interesting about the medieval rich person was guilty, felt guilty, and and it's funny, we often look with a kind of superiority. Oh, look at those guys, giving money to monasteries and going on crusades and standing out in the snow naked doing penance. Where here we just kind of give less to the poor so we can have our second house. and are so happy that God's blessing us in it. And I just think it's funny how everybody's kind of sure. I mean, it's such a corruption of this beautiful message that God is for us, right? And that Christ takes on the rejectedness and the condemnation, and Christ goes to a kind of hell no one ever would go to. And what's funny to me is that we don't seem to appreciate that Jesus did that, and actually we feel like God owes that to us, and we go on our merry way. And that's one thing that I guess is another way that both liberals and conservatives are very alike in terms of their underlying piety.
Yeah, I mean, I think that for Bart, though, the answer to that would not be more threatening, but less. Bart went to a Billy Graham rally when he was here in America, and he didn't love it.
Right. Yeah.
And that was largely because he would think that sort of threatening would just not. I mean, I think of what is transformative is Les Miserables, is meditation upon
right
the blame that should be taken, right? And I think the answer is not less of the divine grace, but more of it. I think the presumptiveness, the answer to the presumptive attitude is not more threats, right? I mean, because that only, I think, exacerbates the problem.
I grew up in that Christianity, but the threat is, if there's a threat there, it's kind of like going to a scary movie. Okay, I mean, a lot of Christianity, whether it be second coming sermons or you're going to go to hell, there's a kind of catharsis. Again, I know many other people experience it in different ways, but all right. You've done all these things bad, you deserve hell, but you know what? Pray this prayer. You're done. You're good. As a matter of fact, I'll even write it in your Bible. You don't have to worry about this anymore. And so what you do is you get the worst of both worlds. You get a kind of distortion that ends up, traumatizing people. And it's a picture of God that, God is love, but if you don't say yes to him, he'll send you to hell. There's that kind of weird theology. But then there's a sense where the bar is really low. It's not about grace. It's not even about genuine repentance or anything. How, let's say, what used to be evangelicalism, like in the Second Great Awakening, where you had to sit on that bench. You may be on that weeping bench for a couple of years, but it's been reduced to, all right, a transaction. Say a prayer. Jesus is my Lord.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think for Bart, he wouldn't find any of that. Any of the transactional stuff, whether it's say a prayer or the bench, right? I mean, none of that stuff would be for him the way that's appropriated, right? In the sense of, it's more like finding your true identity, like understanding who you really are, and
Right.
that, I mean, that's where the transformation comes. When you realize just that your own identity doesn't have meaning except in the election of God's own story. It's funny because I was thinking about yesterday. I got off at Kensington Allegheny, which I have not done in a very long time, and I just walked, and it was like 5 o'clock, and I was only there for a minute, but and I was like, wow, and this term came to my mind that people say, you just hear, this is a godforsaken place, right? That this is, and it does look like that. I mean, I saw a National Geographic special 6-8 months ago on Kensington and Allegheny. I mean, it's one of the worst drug infested cultures of death in the country. And it's interesting with Bart, there is no godforsaken place when he reads the New Testament, and there's no, because God's creation is what he chose to be for. He chose to be for us. He chose to be for the world. So there's no godforsaken part of the world, and there's no godforsaken people, right? There's no, which I think, sometimes when you read people that believe in double predestination, like Calvin and some other people, they think they know who the elected reprobate are. They see it when they're preaching. The guy sleeping and making the fart noises at me and gesticulating. I can tell he's the God-forsaken one. And there's no God-forsaken people, and there's no God-forsaken part of our own lives, our own stories, right? I think one of the reasons it's so hard for us to be self-aware is because it's hard to see we do think parts of our story are God-forsaken or places the light can't go, and there just aren't those things, right? These things are all of the good, the bad, and the ugly is the covenant partner of God. And a lot of people probably, half the people listening to this podcast or more think America is God-forsaken right now, that given certain political choices and the cultural movement and seismic shift that we feel like we're in, and there's so much surprise for so many people that this is the God, but it's not, that there's no, it's not God-forsaken, right? That we still live in a world which God is for, and if God is for it and for us, I mean, who can really be against us, right?
But not any more America than Haiti. I think that's the problem. I think there's a sense where we are, as Haiti is not any more forsaken than America.
Right. There's no square.
But nor is America any more favored than anywhere else. And I think that's part of the problem, right? It's not. I think in some levels it's that, it's funny. There's a sense where all of this should lead to humility and gratitude, but it doesn't in the contemporary American church, and I think that's part of the problem, right? It's like, I think it's amazing, liberating doctrine. I think it's a wonderful insight. I agree with Bruce McCormick, but I don't think the problem in American Christianity is we don't feel that we're chosen, or we don't feel that God's on our side. I don't think that's the problem. I think that I think we often feel chosen, particularly in our reprobate places. And I think this is a doctrine, which is the irony of it, is because you don't really think of Calvinists as being humble people, right? And yet, if you really believe this should make you. And again, I think this was Calvin at his heart, why it was a point of his piety. Should make you humble and grateful and thank you, full of gratitude, and should make you want to, kind of like Dante, when that first time he tasted love, you should go forward and not want to harm anyone. And so, what is missing that's not the fruit of this doctrine in our country?
Well, I don't think it's the doctrine. Like, I don't think the problem is that people don't get what Bart's talking about. I mean, I think that
they don't get what Jesus is talking about.
I think it's natural theology. I think that it's the same stuff Bart was actually afraid of, right? That I think the God that I think people in the United States think that has chosen them is not the God that elected to be God in Christ, to be the covenant partner of the people of God or something. It's folk religion. It's the American God. Yeah. It's there's this great thing print you can buy. Google it. In fact, I'll put it in the show notes. I will. Sometimes I say it and I don't. I'll do it. You can buy a picture of the founding fathers with Jesus in the middle at the Independence Hall.
Yeah, no, I agree. No, you're all right. It's natural theology with praise choruses.
Yeah, I mean, so I think the answer isn't less election, but more of it.
It's really, I'll leave it, but this feels like something you would have told me before, but I think it's Netflix. There's a series called Chaos with a K. It was not renewed, but Jeff Goldblum plays Zeus.
Oh yeah, I haven't watched it, but yeah.
But Prometheus is the protagonist, if you would, and Prometheus is mostly shown nailed in like a cross against a mountain, and it's a very interesting. Zeus, in many ways, represents most of what we think is success, power, and prosperity in this country. The three things Jesus said no to, Zeus, and I'm afraid our country continues to say yes to. And it's a very interesting, the iconology. whether it was a great show, I don't know, but that alone, that having Prometheus once again trying to save humanity, is an interesting a show that probably is not sympathetic to any kind of religious sentiment, but the image of a crucified God, because Prometheus was one of the original, wasn't he one of the original Titans, or one of the original? He and Zeus were contemporaries, at least in this version of the mythology. You still, the idea that a crucified God is still offering salvation for people, a powerful part of our faith. It's a mythology that Rene Girard says it's a mythology of the history of the world, and it became true in the person of Jesus. So that's certainly still believe that.
Yeah, and even in the midst of our no's, there's always a yes. That as Halik said, it's the eternal word.
The eternal word
that is spoken again and again. So Amen. that is a good word in tumultuous times.
All right, man.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for listening. Peace.